Well, today I want to conclude the why of suffering. What's going on in our world that causes suffering? I'm not going to answer the question of why God allows suffering. Why does God allow this bacteria to infect someone? We understand through science that sometimes bacteria infects people. I'm not going to get into that quite yet. And then we're going to talk about evil in the Bible and just dive into the demonic and the devil. And we'll talk a little bit more next week after the Enlightenment, after now that we have science, now that we have psychology, how do we talk about evil, how do we talk about the devil, and all of those things in our world today. So we're going to do that much more next week. Today we're going to look at the biblical understanding of evil and see some diversity there, as well as some opportunities for us to believe in our world today. So, as a bit of a review, after the Enlightenment, after the 1700s, it's really no longer plausible to say that all suffering is caused by God. Science helps us understand our world in new ways. That's not to say God isn't ultimately responsible for granting us free will. It's not to say God isn't ultimately responsible for creating this world. And it's not to say God isn't behind some suffering, but to say that everything is caused by God is no longer plausible. Last week we talked about this God, a God who is relational, a God who turns over some of God's own power. So God is not the only one who has something to say. God creates through speaking, but God also gives us a voice in the conversation. That is prayer. God's not the only one with something to do or the power to do it. God gives us tremendous power. The scary thing is that God gives us the power to sin, just as God gives us the power to serve. God gives us the power to create, but also the power to destroy. And so honoring of that relationship means honoring the capacities that God has given us. A lot of people would refer to that as our free will. I just got started in the why of suffering last week, so I want to quickly hit these things. Why of suffering? Well, we as human beings are created with limits. Intelligence, agility, strength. Testing these limits, obviously, creates the possibility of suffering. If you jump out of a perfectly good airplane, I don't know why you would do that. If you do that, you create the possibility of going splat. You create the possibility of suffering. God has also created a dynamic world where earthquakes and volcanoes and glaciers, bacteria, all these things have their role to play. And we are part of this creation. So, sometimes, where creation intersects, where we come into interaction with things like volcanoes, there is the possibility of getting hurt. I saw on the CNN this morning that in Japan, 30 people at the base of the volcano were likely killed as it erupted. If you were at the base of the volcano when it erupts, in that place where creation intersects, there is the possibility of getting hurt. Why does God allow that? It's part of free will, part of your opportunity to go and camp at the base of a volcano is your free will. But it is a challenge for us as we think about the loss of life and say, God, why didn't you intervene? A question that we'll get to. Part of suffering sometimes is a vocational calling. We engage certain suffering for the sake of our neighbor. Certainly we could avoid that suffering, but by entering into the suffering with our neighbor, we help them along the journey. 1 Corinthians, if one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice with it. When a child is born with a birth defect, mental incapacity, you as a parent are, whenever a child is born, you're thrown into a new vocational calling. But those parents who have children with Down syndrome, many times, most of the time, they can't keep working. They have to care for this child who requires almost constant care. Part of their vocational calling is to suffer along with this child. We as a church recognize that part of our calling is to engage that suffering as well. How do we engage that suffering? How do we see the neighbor who is in need, and instead of seeking our own delight, our own pleasure in this world, how do we go into the midst of that suffering and be with our neighbor? That's our vocational calling as the church. Sin also increases our experience of suffering. Sin has consequences. We understand that. It's not deterministic, meaning because you steal a piece of candy when you're 5 years old, that does not mean that God is going to bring consequences on you later in life. Because you do X does not necessarily mean that God is going to bring about a punishment upon you later. However, there are times when the fruit of our schemes comes back to visit us. This is not karma. This is judgment. This is God's law in action. Romans 13 talks about how authorities are in place. Police officers, judges, people who make laws are in place to enforce God's consequences. That murder and stealing and lying and cheating, all these things, there are people in place to help enforce the laws. And you will get in trouble if you break the law. Sin is also action and inaction. So it's not just the things we do as we regularly confess, but it's also the things that we leave undone. And those things have consequences, both on us and the communities around us and the people around us. For that reason, sometimes people suffer. Does that make sense? Lots of nodding heads. Okay. Sin is both individual. It's your lying, you're cheating, you're stealing, abuse. But there's also larger communal, national, cultural sins that are present in the world. Sin of arms races. Have you ever thought of that as a sin? You might not be able to see this. In the New York Times in 2012, there was an article that talked about how the United States overseas weapons sales totaled $66.3 billion last year. Russia was the distant second with $4.8 billion in deals. So we sold $62 billion more than any other weapons than any other country in the world. At what point does it go from defending our country to sin? Something to consider. When so much of our country's income is dependent upon people killing each other. There's also sin of first world wealth and greed, that we would seek to essentially steal from the poor so that we could have more finances. Corrupt governments. other cultural sins. Apartheid in South Africa. That was just part of the culture, and this is what we do. The corruption of governments that we see across the world today. How do those cultural, communal, national sins impact their communities? How do they impact the larger world? Things to think about. Also, the sin of environmental disaster due to technology. We think we're so smart, and we build and we increase our technology, and then natural disaster happens, and there's a nuclear spill. And is that sin that this disaster has happened? Something to consider. We suffer not only because of our sin, but because of the sin of others. We see that in the world as we think about what's going on in the Middle East and all of that conflict. Like I said, this arms race stuff, this is not an easy topic to engage. There isn't an easy answer as we seek to defend those who are suffering, and yet we as a country have built up a tremendous amount of military power. We have to use it at some point, don't we? That's part of the argument of the military-industrial complex. We have all these bombs and planes and tanks. Should we not use them to defend the neighbor? Probably so. Is that the only way? Not necessarily. Biblically, suffering happens because of the sin of others. We see it in the people enslaved in Egypt, people of Israel enslaved in Egypt. God's response to that was salvation. And God works through many and various ways to accomplish that salvation. Throughout the Bible, God works through armies, God works through his own might, God works through changing the hearts of people to bring about salvation. And God worked, in this case, through plagues. So we see that sin is something that God responds to throughout history. It may not be an immediate response, but God does respond to national, communal sin as it's made known in this world. Dr. Fredheim, who wrote one of the articles that I put on the website, says, we also suffer because we belong to communities that have a long history of sinfulness, with the result that its effects could be named evil or integrated into the very structures of our life together. So, ageism, racism, sexism, as we're born into these things, we all contribute to these systemic evils. Growing up in Montana, I learned racism about our Native American brothers and sisters. That's just part of being a first grader and having someone with a different skin color come into your class, and everybody talks about the Indians. And we know what the Indians do, right? And you learn it more as a 5th grader and as a 7th grader. And by the time you're in high school, you know every stereotype there is. We all contribute to these things. Can we name them as evil? Can we name them as our own sin? And can we turn from that sin? That is one of the questions that we face weekly as we come to church and we confess our sins, examining ourselves. Questions on these things. Those are some of the whys of suffering. We're created with this tremendous free will. There is sin that increases our suffering. But there are also times where we enter into that suffering to engage the neighbor in need. All of these things contribute together to our experiences of suffering in the world. All right. Well, let's get to the good stuff. What is evil? When you think of evil, what comes to mind? Crystal meth, right? Methamphetamines. Other things.
Something that's harmful.
Something that's harmful. Are there evil people? Yes? Those that sell meth.
I'm stuck on that today.
Right. Sure. You guys are a little hesitant to start naming names, though, aren't you? My brother.
Well, I think that you all have been evil. It's part of the reason why we find salvation in forgiveness in church and community. Because even though we call ourselves Christian, there's certain evil. That's all we can talk.
Right. That's good. Brings up the question, how do you distinguish between sin and evil? And is there a boundary line where you cross over from one to the other? Or is that too gray? According to the dictionary of theological terms, evil is any act or event that is contrary or opposes the good and holy purposes of God. Paul Sponheim, who there's a gigantic book, and there are 5 volumes, 3 volumes, sorry, of Christian dogmatics. He says evil may be experienced and described simply as that which thwarts such purposes as seem intrinsic to the human condition. So, that which thwarts life, that which thwarts living well, thwarts caring for each other. That, according to Sponheim, would be evil. As philosophy defines it, there are 2 different kinds of evil. They want to separate the 2. Moral evil, which is sin, murder, lying, stealing, cheating, abuse, dishonesty, is one. But then there's also natural evil that you can't really blame on people. Hurricanes, floods, cancer, birth defects, disabilities, mental illness. You can't really blame these things on people. Sorry?
Last week you said that the world is created by God. Both the blessings of God, and hurricane.
Right.
Now this week they're going to term his creation as a lack of people.
I am. That which thwarts the good and holy purposes of God, that which rebels against God and God's purposes, can be defined as evil. Is God at work bringing about that evil? Some of us might get a little nervous about saying God is bringing evil, but that's what the Old Testament says again and again. That God did this. So we'll look at that a little bit more.
I have a question about greed.
Yes.
What is the definition of greed?
Uh,
What I'm hearing nationwide politically is if a person works hard, becomes successful, they're labeled as being greedy.
I don't think I would
That is in the political arena here, especially in the last 6 years.
Right. No, it is a political flashpoint, and probably part of the reason I included it here. Greed is being consumed for a desire for money, That your focus is on making money above all else.
Well, look at the Koch brothers. They're constantly being attacked for being greedy, yet they give away hundreds of millions of dollars to hospitals and other charities.
Sure.
But all of a sudden they're greedy. I don't get that.
I I wouldn't define, put it a different way. It's difficult to parse out people's intentions. And so it's not my place to call someone greedy or not. Does greed exist? Absolutely. Are there people who hunger and thirst for more wealth? Absolutely.
But I don't think that should be labeled as sin.
Hungering and thirsting for more wealth?
Exactly.
I think when it impairs...
Look at Bill Gates.
Sure.
Look at Warren Buffett. How many billions of dollars have they given away because of their greed for more wealth?
They are certainly able to help other people.
And yeah,
I'm saying when your hunger and thirst for wealth impairs your ability to serve the neighbor, that, by my definition, is greed.
we have to disagree on
Okay, that's
It's
fine.
the Bill Gates that greed, but don't give it away or help others, but keep it for themselves, just for the greed,
that.
wanting it
He's got the
themselves.
biggest foundation in the world.
Right?
He's giving away money.
Oh, there are tremendously wealthy people who give away lots and lots of money. We can't say if they're greedy or not. There are tremendously wealthy people who don't give away very much money. But we, again, don't know their intentions. I think we need to, when confronted by the issue of greed, we need to search our own hearts. Are we being greedy?
I think someone like Bill Gates, money was a byproduct of their creativity. I don't think he went to work to make money every day. He went to work to create a new idea in the computer. Money was a byproduct. That's a big
I agree.
I think you have to really examine yourself as an individual and your relationship with God, and what part of you is sinning, what part of you is, living your passion and doing something that you see as providing value and making the world a better place. And I think someone who's very, very poor could be greedy just as easily as somebody who's very, very rich. And money is a secondary thing, but it doesn't necessarily reflect whether or not there's
Right. And Jesus talks about money all the time. And he has much harsher words to say than I will even ever dare propose. Talking to the rich young ruler says, give away everything you have, come and follow me. He couldn't do it. And we can make all kinds of justifications why we wouldn't do it. But if I give away all I have, then I can't help these other organizations. I'll just be like one of the poor people. Come and follow me, Jesus says. And it's that. I can't parse that one out for my own life.
It seems like in some ways evil. Things can be bad, not necessarily evil. And that evil, I think, is kind of one of those things where, in a sense, you know it when you see it. I think we are sort of wired to know something is evil. And some people,
I would like to think that, although there are certainly
you can't be fooled.
deceptive people.
Sure, yeah, I'm not that. You can be fooled. But I think in a sense we do have some of that. But I think in your relationship with the church or with God, it helps you to discern evil maybe a little better.
And not only discerning evil in others, but discerning in
Ourselves.
ourselves.
I sort of one of the things in regards to saying about this whole idea of labeling who's greedy and who's not. And I think that goes back to the previous slide with that systemic sin that you have within a community. And our role is to be careful about jumping on board and saying, yeah, those evil folk brother who maybe we don't know, or jumping on board and saying, they should be doing this or whatever. But just, taking that personal responsibility and not making judgments about things that you don't know, and not further, fulfilling that judgment.
wrestling with how our actions are perceived by others. Not necessarily that we need to change them, but also acknowledging how others might perceive the way we live. And I sometimes wonder the family promise people who come and sleep in our church basement, and how they perceive us. Certainly we as a congregation can afford this building. What are their thoughts? Now, how do we perceive them? It's interesting to think about.
Doesn't that kind of come back to how bold we are at the church and maybe that's where I don't remember anywhere once that we used bold as we did.
It's true. I don't remember that either.
I think the shortcoming would be on our side that perhaps with that conviction that's required of us.
You were listening to the sermon this morning, weren't you?
We're all also just on different rungs of the ladder, because we consider as African Americans and head to the Koch brothers or Bill Gates. But we're way up the ladder living in America. But like they say, if you're born in America, you're already on the ladder. Because most of the world is many levels below us.
No, I read something one time that said that 99% of Americans believe that they are middle class. Think about that. 99% of us believe we're middle class.
The biggest issue with all of these things is that it's all relative. We're measuring
Yeah.
things relative to what? That's a moving target, and that's where
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think also too, as a church, or even in Jesus' case, he was a really good guy. There's still people that hated him. And, would have attacked him in the drop of a hat anyway, even though he was doing his works.
Right?
We like to reduce it.
Well, let's keep moving here. All right. One of the things that we need to avoid whenever we talk about evil is we need to avoid dualism. Dualism is a heresy that developed pre-Christianity, was condemned by the church early on. It's something that we need to be aware of and just watch out for. Dualism, God having two natures. That the God of the Old Testament is good, or bad, but the God of the New Testament is good. That is dualism. Also, that there is a good God and an equally powerful bad devil. That's also dualism. That these powers are equal, and on one pole you have God, and one pole you have the devil, and we'll just see who wins. That's a heresy because God is God. Everything else is created. The devil never has that much power, and we don't need to give him any more power beyond what he has. So we're gonna talk about dualism a little bit more when we get to the New Testament. We do see the challenges of the devil. It's called a limited cosmic dualism that's present in the New Testament. We'll get into that a little bit more. First, I want to look at evil as it's presented in the Old Testament. And we're going to see some difference between New Testament and Old Testament. So evil is seen as something that is negative or something that is God opposing. The Hebrew word is ra. And so as you read through, not that you're going to be reading in Hebrew, but going through the Bible, there are all kinds of things that use this word ra. So the people of the city said to Elisha, the location of the city is good, but as my Lord sees, the water is raw, and the land is unfruitful. So, as you're reading through your Bible, some of the things that this word evil, English translators have said, actually means bad. Another word, wretched. Bring us up to this wretched place. Where there's no grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, there's no water to drink. Is that evil? No, it's just a bad place to be.
It matches the definition of from the dogmatic dictionary of things, loving life.
Right.
And acts of water.
Yeah. Genesis, brothers say about Joseph, let's kill him and throw him into one of those pits, then we shall say that a wild or an evil animal has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. So, in the Old Testament, a lot of times this word evil is used to describe something that is simply bad. Something negative, brackish water, famine, death, destruction. This comes from God. It's created by God. Isaiah 45, I form light, I create darkness, I make weal, and I create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. That's classic Old Testament theology, that God is sovereign, God does all of these things. Evil is also something that's God opposing. So the actions of people. Murder, destruction, false worship, pride, as well as the actions of nations that rebel against God. These are not from God, and God also doesn't stop them in a lot of cases. God does respond, but God does not stop them. Evil is embodied in the lawbreaker. So if you break the law, sin, the evil one must be purged from your midst. So don't break the law. Evil is also embodied in mythical creatures. Leviathan, Behemoth, Rahab. These are all managed by God. They are serpents of the sea. You take your ship out to sea and it capsizes. Well, who did that? Well, that was Leviathan, which you know. So they're mythical creatures. And people who stand against the will of God, such as Pharaoh, and also God's people who refuse to do God's will. Evil is embodied in them. Picture of Leviathan for you. Ship. A sea creature that comes up and destroys your boat as you're fishing. You say, wait a minute, what about Satan? Well, the Satan is in the Old Testament, but he has a very different role than what we see in the New Testament. In Job, the Satan, that's the Hebrew word pronunciation, is the accuser. He's part of the heavenly court. So in the book of Job, this accuser comes, and he's like the other angels. He's been walking around the earth. He's observed some things. He accuses both Job and God. And so God has to respond to the accusations. Ultimately, the suffering that comes upon Job comes about because God wills it, and God allows it. God hands over the power to this accuser, this Satan, so that the suffering will happen, but God is ultimately in control in that situation. In Chronicles, we get the only proper name of Satan. Interestingly, in 2 Samuel, the same story is told, but the character is God. So in 1 Chronicles, Satan rouses David to take a census of the people. And this is seen as a bad thing because he's not trusting God to accomplish the military might, the feat that's in front of him. 2 Samuel tells the same story. This time, it's God who is rousing David to take a census. So it's a little bit bizarre. We're not sure if Satan is a later addition by editors, or if it's a proper name of some character, or if it was just a typo by the scribes. In Zechariah, he's also a legal accuser. I think the lawyer standing in this legal courtroom. Throughout the Old Testament, though, we can say that the Satan, is an adversary both to people and to God, but he is submissive to the workings and the will of God. So, Old Testament, God is sovereign. God is in control. There's no dualism. Creation can rebel against God, but both good and evil come from God. God's response is the promise of a hope-filled future. Questions about any of that? Does that sound foreign to you? Yeah. Well, we've only got a couple minutes here, so I'm going to zip through this. Evil in the New Testament. From beginning to the end, it's characterized by a conflict between good and evil. God and the world, Jesus and Satan. It's not dualistic because God and anti-God, they don't share the same powers. So we don't have that. There is, however, a cosmic struggle between this good and evil, Jesus and Satan. That's called a limited cosmic dualism, because at any point there's a sense that God could just squish Satan. This is a rebellion by this Satan, but it's not something where he ultimately has that much power. This rebellion is brought about by Jesus' announcement of the kingdom of God. So Jesus says, the kingdom of God is here, and that's what drives this Satan and the various demons we see crazy throughout the New Testament. Evil comes from within the human person. People do evil. We see that. In bold, our response to evil is resistance. Stand up against the evil that you see. And God's response to evil is that he's going to allow it to coexist for now. Parable of the weeds and the wheat. The workers come and say, we see all those weeds out in the field, can we go pluck them out? And the landowner says, wait, we'll gather them at the harvest, separate them then, and then they will be burned. The same way, that's what's going to happen with evil. And Jesus' response to evil is that he grants his disciples power over the evil spirits. Well, we'll get into the devil and Satan more next week. And we'll talk about both the biblical response and understanding of the devil and Satan and demons, as well as what we can say about them in our world today, understanding psychology and sociology and all of the science that's related. So, more next week. Any questions? Okay.